Hello, happy June, happy Pride, and happy official start to the summer reading season, and for me personally, Freckle Watch 2023. With that, it also means that it is the time of the year where to film, I have to turn off the window unit for my air conditioning. So I might come up with a better system this year. Odds are not great though. So if any time over the next 3 months I start to just glisten, that's 100% on purpose. Why would you think anything else? So today is also going to be a test because I did go to one of the bigger concerts for this year on Friday, which means I really have no sense of how much voice I have left. I'm actually thinking I'm in a pretty good place, but yesterday I was pretty much wiped for the whole day because even though I live in the city, I didn't get to bed until around 3:30. Part of that was 100% my own fault because in my stupor, walking the 10 minutes max from my friend's apartment home to my apartment, I slammed their gate to their building on the heel of my foot. So then I kind of had to wait for the bleeding to subside in order to get to bed. But we're not here for any of that. We're here for the books. So usual caveats. This is kind of a summary overview of things I am interested in. However, I always miss things and will always miss things because I am human and books slip through the cracks. So as always, feel free to shout out June releases that you are excited for, that I may have missed or maybe aren't on my radar at all, or feel free to co-sign your excitement for any of the books I do talk about, because again, we're here to build excitement for these books because there are always a bunch of releases during a month and it's always easy for things to slip through the cracks. Heck, this month I was doing kind of my cursory overview and I was initially like, wow, this is a lighter month than I thought it would be. But then as I kept digging through both Goodreads, Edelweiss, the Millions book preview are all places I kind of go for my first kind of roundup of titles. And again, this is filtered by what I'm personally interested in, by my review of those titles, but I ended up with 29 books. So started with, oh, I don't think there's as much coming out this month as I thought. Maybe I will get caught up on some of our previous release months. Nope, absolutely not. We're just gonna be behind forever. And as readers, I think we just have to accept that. But to start us off, the first 2 weeks of the month are the heaviest. And I expect that that's probably because we are trying to pad in as much of this summer reading time as possible. And for these books to be able to build up their buzz for the summer reading months. Honestly, I think we saw a lot of summer book releases in May as well for this reason, to kind of let them build up steam coming into the summer. But we've honestly got a wide variety of kind of feelings here. We've got the things that feel like more typical kind of summer reads, and then we've got things that feel a little bit more dark and atmospheric, which if you, again, have been here for any length of time, you know I gravitate toward year-round. So let's go ahead and jump in on June 6th. We have the 4th volume of Youre Olympus by Rachel Smith coming out. This may be the first volume I catch up with in more real time in terms of the publication timeline. As I've said before, I know this is coming out on Webtoons, and I have no concept of how far we are in the story on Webtoons in comparison to these published volumes. I am getting these from the library, so I'm gonna really be beholden to that wait time, and I'm not gonna stress it too much in terms of getting my hands on it right away if there is a wait time, but I am interested in catching up with this. It is obviously, or not obviously maybe, a Hades and Persephone retelling through this graphic novel format, and I'm very interested in the world it's creating and seeing Hades and Persephone kind of develop as characters within this world. We are obviously in the slow burn, I would say here, and if you have read further in these comics, in these webtoons, are a little bit more caught up on its release, you can confirm or deny whether you would classify this as a slow burn. But I also think that that makes sense in terms of starting in this more serialized format, because as a fanfiction reader who really got her legs under her in the 2000s, it felt like a lot of the stories that I read, because I read a lot of the longer stories, had this really slow burn, this lead up, because it was about cultivating that desire in the audience to keep coming back, but also kind of building that tension. Similar to in a television series, like something like Bones, where we had this will they, won't they, but we know in the mythology here we can assume that there will be a will they. It's just how is that going to change the world and what is the will they going to look like? Again, I have not read the webtoon, so I don't know what that will they is going to look like. So I'll be very interested to see where this volume takes us. But as a reader, kind of based on the pacing so far and where if I remember correctly, we left off in the story, I don't know that I'm anticipating any kind of will they in this volume, but very interested to see how that continues to build. And the art style in this is really engaging for me as a kind of casual consumer of graphic novels. I say that mostly because I can't speak to the intricacies of the art design, but I really enjoy it. And then moving right along, we have one of the more anticipated memoirs for the year, I would argue, Page Boy by Elliot Page. I am very excited to see what this is going to look like. I think I am going to listen to this. I'm also kind of on this constant search right now for a memoir or something of that nature that I think is going to be an actual competitor for Spare come the Goodreads Choice Awards. And I think that this is going to have a really compelling story behind it, a really compelling view, and it's not fair necessarily to put it up against Spare, obviously. I think maybe the BTS book, depending on how much of autobiography or memoir that really ends up being, I think could both be interesting books to share a similar space and are interesting stories. Additionally, I think this in terms of celebrity autobiography, I had struggled with celebrity autobiography for a long time because when it didn't feel like there was really anything to say, it just felt like a kind of formality to put out a book. I think this really offers, obviously, Elliot a place to tell his story in his own words and to give the public and his fans a peek into his life in an honest and raw way while still having a little bit of a barrier, in the sense that you can get really raw and vulnerable in the written word, and there is a huge bravery to that, but that you can protect yourself from that a little bit as well through it being the written word, and it feels a little less raw potentially than like getting on camera and saying similar things. Though I think if this has a press tour, we're obviously going to have elements of that, and this is obviously going to bleed into his work because I'm sure interviewers will ask about pieces of this book. Again, I haven't read it. I don't know exactly what we're going to be covering here, but I am so excited and eager to hear his story. And I think too, I have become a little bit more accepting of celebrity memoirs as we have kind of grown into an era of me getting memoirs by celebrities that are part of my celebrity sphere, I guess, or just, you know, actors, creatives, artists that I grew up with. So I guess I understand it now. I get it. I understand why there's such a thirst for these stories, but I still think that it's really important to have a reason to be telling the story, like I said, and I don't think that there's any denying of the power of the story here and Elliot's claiming of his voice. So again, very excited. And then we have Dark Hearts by James L. Sutter. I do believe this is YA because it is coming out of Wednesday Books, but it follows a young man, David, who had been in a band, and after he quit, the band goes on to become this huge pop duo sensation. And in the meantime, he is just kind of back in a normal high school life. But there's also a sense that there was some kind of major falling out there because after one of the remaining members passes away, David is thrown back in the orbit of the other member, Chance, who he is kind of got a frenemy situation going on with. He kind of resents Chance's attention seeking as he views it, even as these circumstances are pushing them back together and rekindling or kindling, unsure because I haven't read it, some sort of feelings between the two. And so it's both David kind of figuring out his relationship with Chance, but also his relationship with fame on some level, I would think, and also kind of mourning this loss on whatever level. But at its heart, it does feel like this is going to be a romance and a celebrity romance, obviously. And then we have The Art of Liberomancy by Josh Cook. There is a longer subtitle that should be visible on the cover, but this is a collection of essays about bookselling in the modern age. I don't know how big of a release this is going to be, but as a former bookseller and someone who is constantly interested in the industry, I'm very interested in reading these essays days, and just kind of examining the landscape of book buying, book selling, being a bibliophile on whatever level as it stands now. Based on the blurb, it's going to touch on things like book selling in relation to capitalism, kind of tension between what is popular and this idea of good taste, which has always existed on some level, but just what that is in the kind of modern era, and also things like the art of hand selling. And if you've never spent time book selling or around booksellers, that's simply the art of selling books through conversation in the store. And I think there is such an art to it, and it used to be one of the most thrilling, best parts of my job, especially if you have cultivated a relationship with customers, you kind of have an idea for their taste. Best feeling ever is when someone inherently trusts you to recommend books to them. I had the best woman who I loved working with, and there were two people that she trusted in our store to give her book recommendations, and I'm not gonna lie, that went to my ego a little bit because the other one was our store manager, but it was so much fun picking out books for her because I got to share books that I loved, authors I loved. It allowed for conversation about those books later down the line, and she was often coming to fill up bags and bags of books in one trip, so it gave the high of the shopping spree without having to spend any of my own money, and it was just so much fun. Like, that is the dream. That is what people going into book selling usually are dreaming of, and that is absolutely not everything that book selling involves. But I would argue that those are also the moments that keep booksellers in the game, and this is not a conversation about book selling, so we will be moving on. But maybe we should read that book together and talk about book selling in relation to whatever it talks about. Let me know if that would be of interest. I'm just thinking on the fly right here. Moving on, we have We Could Be So Good by Cat Sebastian, who I would argue is an established name in gay historical romance at this point, and so it's kind of hard to remember how revolutionary it was seeing her books be put into print from Avon. They started as digital only, I believe, and seeing her covers evolve, because I believe she was one of the first authors that I clocked moving from the mass market format to the trade paperback format. And at the time, I kind of theorized that was in relation to kind of positioning her books alongside the red, white, and royal blue aesthetic to capitalize on the popularity of that novel for readers looking for similar reads. But this is her first book, I believe, moving outside of that kind of 19th century, 18th century-ish broad strokes setting. This is a 1950s gay romance set at a newspaper where one of our leads has kind of like worked his way up the ladder into the newsroom, and our other protagonist is set to inherit the newspaper. His newspaper tycoon father wants him to take over, and he doesn't really feel up to the task, but he accepts a position in the newsroom for, I believe, at least a year in order to get a feel for the business. And in this time, our other reporter, Nick, kind of helps him out. So I am not generally drawn to things set in the 1950s, but I think that this is a very interesting setting, especially for a gay romance, when we think of how the 1950s have kind of been mythologized in terms of gender roles. And so I think that there is a lot to play against there, but it also feels like this is going to be a very joyful novel. And in my experience of Sebastian's work, which I am not caught up on in the way that I should be because I just fell behind, her work is very joyful while also acknowledging the realities often. So this will definitely be one of my exceptions to the rule, I think, in terms of where my tastes generally lie. However, the holds at the library for this one are already really long, so I may have to end up buying it. I may wait for it via hold, I'm not sure. Another thing that I found really interesting before I noticed that it was set in the 1950s was that it's blurbed as perfect for fans of newsies, and so I immediately got excited because I thought then that it would be perfect for my friend Mandy, who doesn't generally like romance novels, but has some exceptions, and she loves newsies. So I thought maybe, but the 1950s is a much different time setting than newsies, so I don't know if that would be a deal breaker for her. But if you like the 1950s as a setting and newsies, are you in for a treat, presumably? So excited for this one because I trust Sebastian, and I'm also excited to see her kind of continue to play with new settings and times and kind of scenarios. So we'll see what this ends up being. And then, as much as I said I don't like Westerns, and we've already had one exception this year with Lone Women, which will probably become one of my favorite books of the year. I mean, it's one of my favorite books of the year right now, and I am assuming it will retain that position through the rest of the year. But this month we are also getting a young adult graphic novel, North Ranger, by Ray Terciero and Brie Indigo. And this is a graphic novel, young adult Western reimagining of Northanger Abbey. And how can I not want to read that? I need to reread Northanger Abbey as well, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing that because I read Jane Austen's entire canon between the years of like 8th grade and 10th grade, but Northanger Abbey is kind of a spoof of a Gothic, and I love Gothics. And while I still haven't read some of the biggest names in Gothics, like the Castle of Otranto somehow, that likely inspired Northanger Abbey, I still am probably familiar with the genre enough now to recognize more of where that spoof is, but I'm incredibly excited to see what a modernization of that is going to look like, especially for young adult audiences today, especially with it being set on a ranch. Like, are we going to have a seemingly haunted ranch? I don't know. I guess we will have to read to find out together. And then we have, and this is one of those titles I am going to have to read from my notes, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 through 2008 by Chris Payne. And I am apparently at the age where we can now have retrospective reflections on pop culture moments of my kind of formative years, because I came up during the height of emo. So I am incredibly interested in this. I grew up in the country and the internet was still a much different place at the time than it is now. Like, we didn't have something like TikTok that, even if we weren't kind of close in proximity to something like Warped Tour, where we could still feel like we were part of that, it was a much more curated kind of experience in what we were getting via things like MTV, VH1, or like the kind of early YouTube videos at the time. But it still obviously permeated the culture and makes up so much of my memories of middle school and high school. So I'm very interested to hear, because let's be honest, I'm probably going to do this on audiobook, this kind of cultural reflection on the artists and the music and the phenomenon of it all, and how it kind of permeated, at least for me at least, those teenage years, and kind of reflect on the good, the bad, and the ugly, and all of it. And in keeping it in line here with long nonfiction titles, we have Juliet, The Life and Afterlives of Shakespeare's First Tragic Heroine by Sophie Duncan. Now, I have read Romeo and Juliet a fair number of times because I was a theater major in college. And in fact, one of my favorite projects that I did in college involved reimagining a conception of Romeo and Juliet. And in relation to that project, we really had to dig into the text. But because I got so burnt out on Romeo and Juliet in college, I haven't touched the text for a hot second, so I probably need to. But I am also fascinated, as this book seemingly is, with the kind of cultural perception of Juliet, because I think it is a little warped in some ways. I was in theater school in the era of the Sassy Gay Friend YouTube videos, and we would endlessly quote those, especially the Ophelia and Juliet ones. But I think what we often forget about in the text, in the kind of cultural perception, is that Juliet was the main actor a lot of times. She was the one that was pushing things forward with action. And again, this is all my interpretation of the text, but Juliet was active and Romeo was reactive. So I'm very interested to see what this book is going to say about Juliet, going to say about the cultural perception of Juliet through the ages, and how she's been interpreted through the ages. And then if you are looking for something for the summer that's a little bit more in that thriller vein, we have the newest by S.A. Crosby, All the Sinners Bleed. I still need to read S.A. Crosby. He has become such a force in the thriller kind of mystery genre space, and that's admittedly one of the genres that I am not as up on, but his books have consistently received excellent reviews, and from my perception of his work, they seem to really be able to uniquely tap into the kind of cultural zeitgeist, to really be able to tap into those nuanced conversations in a really active, propulsive powder keg of a narrative often. For instance, the blurb of this novel reads, Titus Crown is the first Black sheriff in the history of Sharon County. A former FBI agent and security expert, Titus came home to take care of his father and look out for his troubled younger brother. He ran for sheriff to make a difference, especially in the Black community, which has so often been treated unfairly by the police. But a year to the day after his election, a school shooting rocks the town. A beloved teacher is killed by a former student, and as Titus attempts to de-escalate and get the boy to surrender, his deputies fire a fatal shot. In the investigation, it becomes clear that the student that they shot had been abused by the dead teacher as well as by unidentified perpetrators. The trail leads to buried bodies and secrets. While Titus tries to track down a killer hiding in plain sight, while balancing daily duties like protecting Confederate pride marchers, he must face what it means to be a Black man wearing a police uniform in the American South. So as you can tell by the blurb, there is a lot going on that mirrors the tension we are seeing reflected almost daily. It also has 5 stars from Roxane Gay on Goodreads, which may mean nothing to you, but means something to me. So moving on, if you want something a little lighter than that for your summer reading or something a little bit more escapist, we have the newest from Alexis Hall, Mortal Follies, and I'm very excited for this one, both in terms of its content and to see Alexis Hall really span a wide breadth in his romance so far, because this is like a fantasy historical lesbian romance about a young woman trying to break a curse on her during the social season, which puts her in the orbit of the Duke, a notorious aristocratic lady, and the blurb distinctly mentions them facing off against angry gods and vindictive magic. So I'm really looking forward to the world created around these two and this bleeding of historical romance and kind of fantasy romance that I really love. So that was all June 6th, and as usual, proof that I am way more wordy than I ever anticipate being. So let's go ahead and move on to June 13th with A Right Worthy Woman by Ruth P. Watson. This is a historical fiction about Maggie Lena Walker, who was a prominent businesswoman in Virginia's Black Wall Street, and she was the first Black woman in the United States to found and preside over a bank. So I think this is a perfect historical fiction summer read that really zooms in on a compelling, strong character and telling and reclaiming her story. Mom, if you are watching, I think that this would be right up your alley. See if the library has it. We then have the new Ali Hazelwood, Love Theoretically. I have not yet read last year's Ali Hazelwood, but this follows Elsie, who by day is an adjunct professor and theoretical physicist, and at night is a fake girlfriend for some extra money, because, you know, the adjuncts are not raking in the cash. And then the older brother of one of her favorite clients turns out to be kind of a nemesis of sorts, someone who ruined her mentor's career and undermined the reputation of theoretical physicist as a whole, and now stands in between Elsie and her dream job. So it seems like it's going to have that typical kind of Hazelwood tension, enemies to lovers type feel. Now I don't know if it's going to also have the typical Hazelwood emphasis on the big burly man and the small dainty woman, which admittedly some people are into. I'm not putting down anyone's favorite tropes. I am just not a petite dainty woman, and admittedly got really burned out on that being the representation in all of the books I had read so far. I really got burnt out on it during the STEMinist novellas because I was listening to them as they came out. So I guess if anyone has read Love on the Brain or read an early release of this book, you can let me know if that has kind of held as a pattern through these two books as well or not. I'm not saying it's going to keep me from reading them. I just haven't gotten to them yet. And then we have Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara. It is a Psyche and Eros retelling. That is all I need to know. If you were around or have watched my video talking about Electric Idol by Katie Robert in relation to the Eros and Psyche myth, and then also the kind of family tree of the Eros and Psyche myth, you know that I love the Eros and Psyche myth, and so I will be reading this. And if you have not watched that video, you now know that I love the Eros and Psyche myth. And so we'll be reading this. And then we have one of my most anticipated books of the month, and that is Madelina and the Dark by Julia Fine. I really have enjoyed Julia Fine's work so far, that being What Should Be Wild and The Upstairs House. The Upstairs House I do have a pretty old Feature Friday on, so feel free to watch, but excuse the quality. And I really like her tone and her experimentation within her fiction. All of her fiction so far has a little bit of an element of the odd to it in some way, though in her two books so far in much different ways. And this again seems like it's going to be a much different book than her books so far. There is an experimentation, a really unique story she's telling here, and this is her first inherently historical fiction to my reading and comprehension, at least, of What Should Be Wild. And so this is set in Venice in 1717, and it follows Louisa, a student of Vivaldi who is proficient but not necessarily a prodigy. And she falls into the orbit of Madelina when Madelina is sent to the same school as Louisa to kind of protect Madelina's marriage prospects. And this leads to a fierce, all-consuming friendship that pushes them outside of the walls of the school and really forces them to face their desires and what they want and what the cost of that is. Which for me, honestly, is compelling enough in and of itself. However, because it is fine, I am also anticipating some level of experimentation, whether it being the tone and the voice or the formatting and style, but the blurb specifically talks about music and magic. So I'm very interested to know what the magic of it is, because it could honestly be many things. Because Fine is local to Chicago, there is going to be a book event in Chicago that I'm hoping to get to for this, so fingers crossed, because I really do enjoy her work and would love to hear her talk about it again. The last time I heard her speak was at Printers Row a couple of years ago when The Upstairs House came out, and it was fascinating to hear her talk about the craft for that book. So I presume, whatever, that it will also be fascinating to hear her talk about the craft for this book. And then also I can buy a signed copy of the book. And then we have The Mythmakers by Youre, and this is about a young journalist who has kind of fallen on some hard times. One of her most recent articles was called out for some inaccuracies. She's kind of stumbling in her personal and professional life when she comes across a short story by an older author that is a reflection of the moment they met and is her life. And she ends up reaching out to the widow after finding out that the author has passed away. And so that idea of seeing, you know, a moment of time in your life reflected in this story that you have no connection to was what initially drew me into the blurb, kind of that exploration. The blurb also talks about this being a nesting doll of a book, which I find a fascinating idea, and I think is reflected in the cover somewhat, though this is also kind of reminiscent of a popular cover style from the past couple of years, still unique to my kind of look at it, but I'm interested to see exactly what that idea of a nesting doll means and what this reflection is on kind of art and inspiration and our own sense of self and the stories we tell and are told about us. And then we have a new Uzma Jalaluddin rom-com right in time for summer reading, Much Ado About Nada, which is unsurprisingly a Much Ado About Nothing retelling. This is actually one of two anticipated Much Ado About Nothing retellings for me this year. We've got this one, and then we have Nisha Sharma's, which is coming out, I believe, in August. We will obviously talk about that when that comes out, the second in the Dating Dr. Dill Shakespeare retelling series. These are two romance authors I really, really enjoy, and I'm so excited to be getting two Much Ado About Nothing retellings, and I'm so excited to see what specific spins each puts on it. I'm especially excited for this to be a retelling from Jalaluddin because I loved her last book, Hana Khan Carries On, which I talked about, but I don't think to my recollection that was specifically a retelling. But as I have mentioned before, Aisha at Last, which was my first Jalaluddin that I read, is one of my favorite Pride and Prejudice retellings because I think it brings a new kind of breadth to the story. It has something to say independent of just kind of matching the Pride and Prejudice beats. So I'm really excited to see how she reinterprets Much Ado About Nothing to fit a modern audience, and she continues to hit it out of the park with her titles. So this is going to be perfect summer romance for me. Very excited. And then we have Something Close to Magic by Emma Mills, which is blurbed for fans of Margaret Rogerson and for fans of Gail Carlson Levine. And based on the blurb, I am definitely feeling kind of nostalgic for something like Ella Enchanted because it follows an overworked 17-year-old bakery apprentice who is given some seeking stones and sent on a quest. And over the course of this quest, this adventure, she is thrown in with Prince Hapless, who is aptly named, but also charming. And so she is thrown into this world of magic and palace intrigue. And so in addition to the authors mentioned in the blurb, I'm also getting like little bits of the T. Kingfisher middle grade novel that I read, or even maybe a little sprinkle of Kelly Barnhill. But I think Gail Carlson Levine is the closest to what this blurb is making me feel in terms of this kind of nostalgia for this particular brand of fantasy and fantasy sprinkled with romance that feels like it's this kind of like epic quest, but also blends in this heart and humor. And the stakes are high, but also not as dark necessarily as some of the modern YA fantasy I also enjoy. It makes me think a little bit of like maybe a spectrum of like cynicism to wonder, where neither are bad, but it feels like it's a little bit more of like this opening your eyes to this larger world kind of storyline. I don't know. It makes me feel very nostalgic, like I said, based on the blurb. And so I'm kind of like chasing that feeling of that late middle grade, early young adult from when I was a teen. And I think that this has the potential to really fill that void. And I think it's something that a lot of teen readers today also need, kind of bridging that gap between middle grade and young adult. And then we have a couple of nonfiction titles. We have Wannabe: Reckonings with the Pop Culture That Shaped Me by Aisha Harris. I love essays about pop culture, and I specifically love essays about pop culture when it overlaps with the pop culture that also shaped me. So I am very excited for this. I will definitely probably be doing this on audio, and I also think it's a kind of perfect summer audio. Like, I can already picture myself just kind of wandering around the city while listening to this and reminiscing. And then on the other side of that kind of instinct to reminisce, we're kind of stuck in nostalgia for a couple books here. We have Young and Restless: The Girls Who Sparked America's Revolutions by Maddie Kahn. And I am very interested in this because we have a tendency culturally to really look down on things that particularly teenage girls like. There is a sense that if something appeals to teenage girls, that it's not as serious, or that teenage girls' desires and likes are not as serious. And so often there is this ignoring of how clearly and concisely teenage girls really can see things. And so I'm really interested in something that seems like it is going to span some history and kind of look at different movements that were started or spurred by young women. And according to the blurb, it's going to span from like the American Revolution to the Civil Rights era. I would hope or be interested in how it also talks about young women and their kind of cultural momentum in the current era, but we'll see. Obviously, those are a couple of our largest cultural touchstones in terms of thinking of movements historically. And then we have Loot by Tanya James, which is a historical novel set in the 18th century and spans across India, France, and Britain, according to the blurb. And it takes a look at colonialism, particularly through the plundering of art and culture through the lens of our protagonist, as we kind of follow his fate and the fate of a wooden tiger he helps create, and how those fates wind together and apart, and how he is taken across the globe partially by the search for this piece he helped create. And then we continue right along to June 20th. We have Where Echoes Die by Courtney Gould. This follows a teenage investigative reporter who, after the death of her mother and receiving a posthumous letter, finds herself in this isolated town full of secrets, and to my reading of the blurb, screams cult. And the exploration of this town and its enigmatic leader bring our protagonist closer to her feelings about the loss of her mother, helps her and her sister purge those emotions, and also brings her and her sister closer together. In some ways, I am reminded of The Project by Courtney Summers. Obviously, they seem like much different stories, but if you enjoyed The Project, I could definitely see you also being drawn to this. Or if you enjoy things that kind of smell like cults like I do, I can see you being drawn to this as well. And then we have I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home by Lori Moore, which is her first novel since 2009. I feel a little guilty because I hear Lori Moore talked about all the time. I especially heard her talked about all the time when I was really deep into Book Riot right after I got out of college, but I've not read any of her work. And so I am intrigued by this as a new title and as her first novel in a long time. However, I could not tell you what this novel is about because the blurb doesn't really seem to want us to know what this is about, but there are a couple of key phrases in here that as I read, you will probably understand why I may be drawn to this. It says, a ghost story set in the 19th and 21st centuries, an elegiac, I think I said that correctly, consideration of grief, devotion, filial and romantic, and the vanishing and persistence of all things seen and unseen. A teacher visiting his dying brother in the Bronx, a mysterious journal from the 19th century stolen from a boarding house, a therapy clown and an assassin, both presumed dead but perhaps not dead at all. And that's kind of like all of the gist of it we really get. How those tie together, I do not know. But if we're spanning time here, there's a lot of ways that this could go. I don't know if maybe they're interconnected short stories or what the framing device may be, but it's also listed at 208 pages, which is a quick, succinct narrative. So I may use this as my entry into Lori Moore, so I feel slightly more cultured, or if nothing else, so I have an answer to what the heck a therapy clown is. Though, do I really want to know? I'm not sure. Though, in a similar kind of twisted vein, we next have 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Agustina Bastarrica, who who is the author of Tender is the Flesh, which I have not read yet, but these are dark, inventive, twisted short stories, and if there's one thing I love, it's dark, inventive, twisted short stories. So I will probably read this first and go back. And then we have The Glow by Jessie Gaynor, which I probably should have talked about closer to Where Echoes Die, because this also has the sense of cult vibes, but this is more aligned with kind of an interrogation of modern wellness culture, because it follows a young PR professional who is desperately in need of a win. She kind of aligns herself with a couple that she sees while scrolling social media that have a wellness retreat that kind of speak to the cult vibes, and there is then an effort to kind of turn them into the next big wellness phenomenon. And so it's seemingly interrogating a lot about wellness culture here, the idea of capitalism and selling out, this idea of kind of pursuing this cultivated perception of perfection, as well as then the kind of cultiness of it all. So I'm really finding myself drawn to narratives that are exploring our lives online and their impact on our actual lived lives, even if I'm not necessarily reading them as quickly as I'm talking about them. So hopefully we'll get on that a little quicker, because I do think it's such a big part of our modern experience, and I don't think we've tapped into it as much across the board in fiction as we could, but it's also this like really unique kind of problem in fiction too, because things move so quickly online, things can feel dated then very quickly, but it also offers unique opportunities as well, I believe, in terms of playing with form and style in terms of storytelling. So there's a lot to dig into there for sure, and hopefully we will read something soon that allow us to dig into that a little bit more as well. And then we have You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kaylin Bayron, that follows a young teenager, Charity, who spends her summer playing the final girl at this summer camp that allows people to kind of recreate these famous slasher films until some of her coworkers start disappearing and one turns up dead. And then Charity's role as the final girl feels all too real, and to survive the night with her girlfriend, they will have to try and find out who the killer is. So especially for fans of slasher horror, I think that this is going to be a really atmospheric summer read for you, with plenty of thrills and screams along the way. I can feel my voice starting to go, which takes us to June 27th, and ironically is appropriate for one of my more anticipated books for the summer, which is Sing Me to Sleep by Gabby Burton, which is a dark YA fantasy following our protagonist, who is a siren. So perfect if you're looking for something to read after the live action Little Mermaid, especially with its focus a little bit more, or slipping a little bit more of that siren lore in, which I really do think helped grease a lot of those plot points. But this follows our protagonist, who is a soldier in training in a world where she has to hide her identity as a siren, and puts her in contact with the prince, who is connected with a lot of these creature segregation laws. She finds herself drawn to him even as they are seeking out a deadly killer, and she is the deadly killer. And the blurb tells us that. That's not a spoiler, because I haven't read this, but that is surely an intriguing plot point and setting up an enemies to lovers type dynamic in the romance with the prince. I am assuming a romance with the prince. It also makes me think of To Kill a Kingdom, which is another kind of like darker YA fantasy mermaid book that I really enjoyed. So I have heard from the blurb itself, if nowhere else, that this is a darker YA fantasy, so very intrigued to see what all of that is going to be. And then we have Where Ivy Dares to Grow by Marielle Thompson, which I am intrigued by because it is a time travel, time slip novel where our protagonist goes with her fiance to his ancestral home because his mother is dying, and she kind of slips back in time to 1818 amidst some of the kind of turmoil of like the secrets of his family being cold toward her, this and that. I'm always or generally intrigued by time travel and time slip, even though I recognize some of the limitations of time travel as a genre. What I'm a little hesitant about in regards to this one is the blurb talks about 1818 as a simpler, gentler age, which feels a little bit reductive historically, because I would argue that no era is really simpler or gentler. So I will see how this is framed. I may wait to see if more people read this, talk about this, but I am drawn to time travel, so I don't know. It is also blurbed for fans of Outlander, which makes sense because it talks about in the blurb her coming in contact with one of her fiance's ancestors and a potential relationship there. I don't know, but based on the blurb, I'm gonna go with yes. So we'll find out, I guess. And then we have Plus One by Kelsey Rodkey, which is about a teenager who is notorious for setting up others. And sure, she's never had a boyfriend herself, but she totally could if she wanted to. And now she has the perfect reason to want to, that being revenge, because she needs to find a boyfriend or a date, if nothing else, by a very specific party to prove something. And this leads her to juggling 6 prospective suitors in 7 days, all while her sister's older friend Adler is watching. And I think we can all anticipate where that will likely end up going, but I, for one, would like to see it. And then finally, we have The Notorious Lord Knightley by Lorraine Heath. It has been a hot second since I have read a Lorraine Heath, but this involves scandal and broken engagements and relationships of convenience, if not marriages of convenience. But there is a notorious kind of scandalous book floating around society, and society already kind of assumes it was written by Lord Knightley because of his reputation. And our heroine reveals the author in order to exact revenge over being left at the altar, but doesn't anticipate this making her enemies. And so then she is pushed toward Lord Knightley as they both attempt to salvage their reputations. And I may be less intelligent than I like to think myself, but I don't understand from the blurb who is actually the author of this book, whether it is Lord Knightley, whether it is our heroine, or whether it is a third party. But regardless, we have a scandalous book and we have our protagonists being pushed together due to circumstances. And over here, we love a little bit of scandal and we loved forced proximity. So I'm excited to read this one. And honestly, what makes summer quite like a little scandal that's not going to impact your life in any way. So that is June. We've got a lot of summer reading to look forward to. I will be very eager to hear what you are looking forward to reading this summer, whether it is anything we talked about here or anything I didn't mention. So let me know what you're excited about. Let me know what you're excited about for summer reading in general. But as always, thanks for hanging out and listening to what I'm excited about in terms of the coming month of reading. I always appreciate it. And with that, like, comment, subscribe, the whole shebang, whatever you're feeling, if you want to. Read something good regardless, and yeah, bye.